It took me 20 years to get around to watching The Sopranos in full, and I'm pretty glad I waited. Had I continued binging with my girlfriend at the time in 2008, who would bring the show's DVDs home from her job at Blockbuster, most of its subtextual explorations of masculinity and the themes of violent exploitation would have been lost on me. Now, as we explore The Sopranos again post the launch of a prequel movie that is likely to turn into a series, I found it didn't really live up to expectations.
Cool, man, a hamburger.
But that's not what this is about. In fact, I wonder if it's even possible as I reflect on how The Sopranos challenged me in ways modern media consistently fails to, and why. I'd venture to guess upon mindful observation that the average white American male can see the worst of himself all over HBO's acclaimed Sopranos. And oh boy, is it ever amplified with a massive bullhorn.
See, I got business associates who are black, and they don't want my son with their daughters, and I don't want their sons with mine.
Personally, in AJ Soprano, I see the most cringeworthy moments of abuse of my own adolescent privilege, completely lacking any self-awareness or humility from my confused and abused masculinity's past. Christopher Moltisanti reflects back to me the ceaseless existential and patriarchal conflict of my present, a struggle to make something of myself under the watchful eye of modern American patriarchy and neoliberal capitalism's strict gaze, or risk cutlery outside its socially accepted lines by reckoning with demons of my past. He represents these glimmers of hope that I might grow into someone capable of love, maturity, community, and real family, if only I can be so bold to take the risk. And Corrado Jr. Soprano, perhaps saddest of all, is my ghost of a potential future. In him, we see a self-hating man who never had an immediate family of his own and is doomed to lose his mind suffering alone due to his poor life choices in an underfunded institution, in tandem with the American experiment itself. Good art invites us to reflect and meditate on our own faults and insecurities. How those faults are resolved is up to us, because stories can't do the work for you. They can't tell you the right way to behave, the correct choices to make, or which are the best manners to have. Modern prestige TV and media often attempt to do exactly that by inviting us to project judgment outward to those other bad white people. I'm already one of the good ones, and this show reminds me of that fact. The Sopranos isn't concerned with babying the viewer into a moral imperative or to feel comfortable in its world. This creates space for nuance each viewer can explore on his or her own terms. That being said, if you find a guy who idolizes or sees the best of himself in any character from The Sopranos, just run very far away. Just get that out of the way. There is a constant throughout The Sopranos, an aggressive performance of 3 centuries of American patriarchal supremacy hitting a critical mass of dysfunction as both the dominant cultural force and a monster grown out of control as everything is crumbling around it and because of it. It's a devil on the shoulder of every white man who has ever lived in this country, built on white male supremacy, whispering to him that the inhumane system hurtling both he, the individual, and humanity itself toward a climate oblivion managed carefully by super wealthy oligarchs is actually the pinnacle of existence that he has somehow earned. It's presented to us as a throne upon which we will rule someday. Somehow. It tells us we'll eventually be one of those oligarchs in pure contentment until the end of time because death isn't real. Aren't we all just temporarily embarrassed millionaires after all? What makes The Sopranos so successful and rewatchable 15 years after its end is that it screams these ugly truths boldly from a mountaintop, forcing the subject it examines to reckon with himself in a much more subversive way than the finger-wagging, shaming pathology modern prestige TV has adapted in more recent years. There will be an audience not emotionally ready to understand the message, but I don't think that makes it any less valuable. There's a reason The Sopranos isn't being dragged out for cancellation in the square of public opinion, in spite of its loud, brash, and occasionally played for laughs portrayals of misogyny, racism, and patriarchy's chokehold on society. The subtext that is constant in nearly every frame of The Sopranos, from the opening moments of Tony's domineering and skeptical presence in Melfi's office until its final abrupt blackout, is that these performances of a broken and exploitative masculinity are spiderwebbing out and wreaking havoc across the community from which these men leech and deal out abuse. The feeding beast that it is, it mutates and destroys whatever good might exist in everything and everyone it touches. What almost every character fails to recognize is that this form of masculinity is eating the men performing it alive too. By the final scene, an unflinching refusal to ever push back against the Freudian id, driven commitment to gluttonously feeding that bottomless pit has been the cause of death for literally every single main male character except possibly Tony, depending on your interpretation of that final scene. And even for Tony, the optimistic take on that final scene is that it's possible he's not dead and our journey with him has just reached an abrupt end. And we're left to sift through what we've learned about him as being the trajectory for the rest of his life. So take a closer look at the final moments of the episode and the decisions that brought Tony there. With the camera placed directly in his point of view for much of the scene, we are shown that his decisions have led him to live even a simple night at a diner with his immediate, closest family in a high alert state of paranoia, terrified that any sudden noise, a shady character, or a man in the bathroom could be his doom. All the while forced to continue the performance of masculinity that has killed every man he's ever had close relationships with. Endless reflections have surely been written about Tony and his journey, but for the purpose of this piece, I'd like to focus on my personal ghosts of masculinity's past, present, and future for a closer examination. So, this is The Sopranos 2 decades later, reckoning with the ghosts of masculinity's past, present, and future. Now, I don't know about you, but I was about 6 years old when I had my first panic attack, and I don't remember a lot of specific details because I was really young and the same thing actually happened several times. And it started with I was put on swim team way too young. I was not physically or emotionally ready to handle being in water in front of a ton of people. So I'd climb up on the giant scary starting block. I'd fall face first in the water. That would cause my goggles to fall off and leak. And so I'd just start feeling like I was drowning and I'd hang on the lane line begging to quit. But the terrifying coach would screech at me from the side going, and that would happen until I either just puddled along and finally made it to the other side, and a couple times I climbed out in shame and embarrassment. I quit swimming for several years because of those experiences. Even in high school, when I was back on swim team and I was pretty darn good, every dozen races or so, I'd choose a pair of goggles that was worn out and they'd leak and I'd have the same panic attack. Now, it's taken me another 20 or so years of all these just minor little traumatic events and abuses adding up on top of each other and causing similar reaction before I finally went, oh hey, there's something wrong here, huh? And I began to deal with it. And the most prominent thing I placed the blame for that delayed diagnosis and treatment on is my cultural understanding and internalization of masculinity. In Season 3, Episode 3 of The Sopranos, Fortunate Son, AJ takes a hard hit on the football field and begins to act strangely. He reaches for condiments at the dinner table and just is completely whiffing them. He tries to report not feeling well and he goes unheard. The episode ends with him passing out where he stands on the football field, seemingly apropos of nothing. The show chalks this up to AJ apparently having the panic attack gene, like his dad. I've been told some version of that same thing by friends, family, and practitioners alike. Personally, relating to another traumatic experience I've had of undiagnosed concussion, that episode ended and I did the Leo DiCaprio pointing at the TV meme and I shout, AJ has a concussion and no one notices or cares. Sure, the panic attack's relatable, but the show would have you believe this is all genetic. This theory of mental illness always being genetic or caused by chemical imbalance in the brain was all the rage in the early aughts during the show's production. Nature over nurture.
As I started to see the effects of psychotherapeutic drugs, I think I found myself more and more tempted by biological materialism, by the thought that larger expanses of personality, ever larger expanses, were determined by biological underpinnings. Seeing patients respond very dramatically to Prozac furthered that tendency in myself very greatly.
We also see it as the most we could ever yield masculinity to the stigma of mental health at the time. So the writers seem compelled to pay lip service to that. But this is a show that spends a lot of time seemingly self-aware, exploring generational trauma as a passing down of abuse, not genetics. It's a confusing, conflicting message and one of the show's few thematic fumbles. But I find that our journey with AJ Soprano is exploring the ways in which hurt people to be much more interesting than that shallow diagnosis of genetics. It's obvious to anyone that our main understanding of AJ Soprano on the surface is that he's a spoiled little shit who will coast through life blissfully unaware of his privilege. He can't even be bothered to show up for his own immediate family, as we see classic, comedically played moments like giving his middle-aged mother The Matrix on DVD for Christmas, and furthermore, being too lazy to even bother to wrap it. Again, I can relate back to so many holidays handing family members half-thought-out gifts that were wrapped in a pillowcase. There's plenty of other examples throughout, done bluntly, like his failing school, or with more subtlety, like the fact that he is a loud and awful drummer with no concern for how obnoxious it is to those around him. All details which I absolutely love. Complexity is introduced over time as, through the years, AJ stumbles upon what in modern dialect we'd refer to as getting woke. In Season 3, Episode 4, Christopher, in which the gang struggles to reckon with Columbus Day getting canceled, an episode panned at the time of its release that has only grown thematically more poignant, complicated, and hilariously laced with layers of irony with age.
I'll tell you what it is. It's anti-Italian discrimination.
We witness one of AJ's first forays into what will become his and several other characters' major arc and source of anxiety. What does one do with the alienation of learning that your life's comfort is predicated on others' exploitation? His role in the episode is quite small, as a foil to Tony, who is frustrated by the distraction of the whole debate over Columbus Day. AJ reads from the opening pages of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, quoting Christopher Columbus as sourced by Zinn. "They do not bear arms, and do not know them. For I showed them a sword, they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron, their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all, and make them do whatever we want." Such a great detail for a few reasons. On a more subtle note, there's a bit of comedic play to his character faults we've come to know and love, in that he's only on the first page, and he's already wielding it over his father with a self-righteous, angst-filled rage. That's a dense book that took me years of reading in chunks at a time to get through as a politically interested adult. I'd venture to guess the flunking AJ Soprano isn't getting much further than those first few pages. Second, it plants the seed of AJ learning about his alienation as a person without much other purpose beyond consuming at the hands of others' exploitation. Finally, it's a great selection to exemplify the entire series' underlying themes around the unraveling of a nation and culture built upon violent domination and subjugation of others by showing these things have been a staple of it since literally day one. This moment, not quite halfway through the series, may have been a bit of a non sequitur to his character at the time, as it was shoved into an already very thematically ham-fisted episode. But it informs the continuation of his story as we see the snowball pick up speed and come to a crash landing in the show's final season. AJ's internal conflict with that alienation plays out as we see him having a back and forth struggle of whether to follow in his father's footsteps of repressing the alienation through indulgence in greed, consumption, and violence, or continue to learn so he might challenge his own worldview and see if there's anything that can be done to alleviate the anxiety. The beauty of AJ's arc throughout the story is that even as one of the very few characters who attempts to break himself from the cycle of meaningless consumption and abuse by studying international affairs online and understanding the modern American empire's role in spreading death and destruction around the world, and how he materially benefits from it, no solution for those problems and his sense of alienation from them appears to exist anywhere around him in his own world of early 2000s wealthy suburban New Jersey. AJ's struggle with it, however, sends him hurtling into a deep depression that climaxes in a suicide attempt, followed by inpatient psychiatric treatment. Again, the show's on-screen narrative suggests he just has the wrong genes that cause a chemical imbalance in his brain, which he inherited from his father. The family laments this must be the case and figures medication and time spent out with the boys, which leads to further problems, are the only cures. Given that the era of the show's production was so focused on the theory that mental health is all about medication-based treatment for genetic imbalance, it's interesting to consider if the meta-narrative of his anxieties, mistreatment, and alienation was intentional. Or did the writers and producers truly believe the words they were putting in their characters' mouths on this subject? It's a question I often ask during my viewing. Anyone watching the show through the eyes of more modern psychology sees AJ's story and understands his depression and struggles are a function of trauma and abuse. The impacts of growing up as an unloved afterthought under the roof of an abusive and literal murderer father who is passing on the same unaddressed trauma from his own childhood experience. We now know medication is not necessarily the best or only way to treat this type of trauma, and that actual healing work is usually best done through relationships with professionals who are trained to address these specific issues. AJ Soprano is us. We are him, and as much as it pains me to admit it, there is no escaping or denying my own past. It's a struggle I'm sure many men of my background can recognize with any modicum of mindful observance. From acting out based on ignorance of his race, gender, and wealth-based privilege in his teen years, to the depression suffered upon learning about those privileges and feeling alienated from an ability to do much of anything about it, to repressed and undiagnosed trauma. All of these things were buried by my own performance of a brand of masculinity I knew wasn't healthy for me, but I thought would help me blend into the herd. While I didn't grow up in a wealthy suburb or have physically abusive parents, I lived a financially privileged enough life, almost perfectly generationally aligned with AJ's experience. We grew up as the first generation to easily be able to obtain access online to way more information about our role in capitalist exploitation than our parents' generation. The misfortune in all of this is that our culture, to this day, still offers almost no socially acceptable alternative or acknowledgement of the discomfort and anxiety this causes.
Email rocks!
Welcome, you've got mail.
It'd be too much of a digression from the topic to investigate all the routes I've personally explored in detail, such as, say, a career in nonprofit service, volunteering, relationships, mindfulness, fantasy, music, drugs, alcohol, being vegetarian, yoga, other exercise. But suffice it to say, I've searched far and wide and still found no escape. So for me, the panic attacks, they continue.
The show does a beautiful job, however, capturing AJ's attempt at escape during a very specific moment in American history and culture.
Be seated, please.
The War on Terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, which have only just come to an end 20 years later in the month I originally wrote this. While The Sopranos does a great job dodging the bullet of directly addressing 9/11, as so many other shows at the time did in clumsy ways that would age very poorly, I'm looking at you, The West Wing.
So why is everybody trying to kill us?
It's not everybody.
It seems like everybody.
It's just the Arabs.
The moments when it does wink at it are not its strongest. We see in later seasons members of the crime families bizarrely warming up to the federal agents tasked to tail them. The show also depicts casual racism against Middle Easterners portrayed in a light that is more derogatory than reflective and satirical as racism is throughout most of the rest of the series.
You think there's a chance they could be, Al-Qaeda's?
By its finale in June 2007, however, the U.S. was 6 years deep into what we now know would become that 20 years long war in Iraq and Afghanistan, from which young men and women often return struggling to find themselves in a world unconcerned about treating their PTSD or rewarding their sacrifice, in stark contrast to the flag-waving propaganda for them that was being portrayed in the mainstream media.
'Cause we'll put a boot in your ass, it's the American way.
Which leads us to the final arc of AJ's story. In the last episode of The Sopranos, AJ still struggles with his ongoing depression, which he continues to indulge by going online to study the crimes and follies of America's empire-spreading war on terror. He's lamented that it all makes him feel so sad and hopeless. However, contrasting the horrors of war abroad to the horrors of the war at home, which he is subjected to by engaging in his family's lifestyle, he considers an approach that perhaps the grass is greener on the other side, and he can find a version of the manhood he's been searching for in that war.
It's more noble than watching these jack-off fantasies on TV of how we're kicking their ass. America.
What about it?
I mean, this is still where people come to make it. It's a beautiful idea. And then what do they get? Bling? And come-ons for shit they don't need and can't afford?
You're all over the place. I don't know what you're trying to say.
Keep in mind that the early 2000s was rife with propaganda for military troops and the dignity and honor of being a soldier in the war on terror in a much different way than it is now. Men AJ's age, and mine, were bombarded with advertising, propaganda, and military recruiters in our high school telling us the war would provide us moral purpose in a world that has spent our coming-of-age years telling us we've reached the end of history and there's nothing left to do except sit back and mindlessly consume. That conclusion left many of us feeling spiritually devoid and empty, and it surely is attributable to a fair amount of enlistment.
Be all you can be.
Throughout the episode, we see AJ's considerations of escape through the military hit a few beats. We start by seeing him attempt to begin working out and mention an interest in joining the military.
I'm gonna join the army. What?
His parents are horrified.
My ultimate goal is to qualify for helicopter pilot training. Afterwards, go to work for Trump or somebody. When my enlistment's up, I could join the CIA or something.
You're gonna ask the Donald for some time off from your pilot job to go on CIA missions?
Just a few brief lines of dialogue on this topic do a fantastic job using 6 seasons of AJ's character development to critique the American military system. A common trope of military service is that smart kids will be designated to safer roles as officers or at a desk job. But through the years, we've watched AJ fail miserably at everything he has ever pursued. He's constantly flunking school, getting into trouble, trying new hobbies or career paths, and then immediately giving up as he rapidly loses interest. But whether the subtext of this is intentional on the writers' and producers' part or not, it's brilliant. The presumed safety of your role as an American military service member is much less dependent on your smarts than it is on things like race, social conditioning, and familial wealth. This is also to say nothing of the escalation of AJ's ideas for escape to joining intelligence, as the crimes of the CIA are historically some of the most egregious, unaccounted for, and violent ways we have spread covert violence in the name of the American empire. Throughout the episode, Tony and his wife Carmela desperately seek ways to divert AJ's attention from his considerations of military service. Their solution? Nudge him toward a job with a family friend's sleazy, porn-adjacent media production company using nepotism and a shiny new BMW. And he obliges. He is the absolute king of millennial fail-sons. May we all kneel at the foot of his throne. Having an extra decade's hindsight on the failures of the war on terror, the twist had me jumping out of my seat cheering as AJ proudly steps out of the office of the production company, blissfully unaware of his privilege, having learned nothing, healing none of his trauma, and continuing to bury it deep down through acts of mindless indulgence and consumption. You know, being a man. It's one of the show's most triumphant, albeit cynical, metaphors. That this cycle of misery can never be solved by greater wealth, more consumption, and more greed. But there's also not much other alternative offered to wayward young men in American culture. Seeking growth and healing through these endeavors doesn't make things better. It only dulls the blade, as our spirit is killed via death by 1,000 cuts. Contrasting this option against engaging with the heavily propagandized military is such a satisfying way to portray the vague hopelessness of the millennial male as we entered adulthood. We spent our entire childhood told we have everything and can do anything because of our status as Americans. That nothing can ever go wrong because we live in the greatest, freest country and moment in history. But as we stepped into adulthood, we found nothing but a spiritual void in a collapsing economy that only works in the favor of a small handful of people at the top.
I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because
you guys paid for all this.
Our yearnings for community and connection were left with two options at that time: bury the pain with consumption, or become pawns in a meaningless war over economic resources for the wealthy. The curtain draws on the tragedy that will be the rest of AJ Soprano's life. We understand that the cycle of panic and depression caused by a lack of healthy ways to express masculinity, which our society works so hard to repress rather than heal, is going to continue on. It's been passed on to the next generation.
Perhaps the most crippling aspect of patriarchy in modern times is the difficulty for men to be open or find spaces that we could process feelings, trauma, and abuse. I've personally experienced sexual, verbal, and emotional abuse in relationships, both platonic and romantic, male and female. For decades, I overextended my sense of empathy and refused to see myself as a victim.
Thanks, modern masculinity.
Of the smaller abuses I'm comfortable discussing with friends or family, I used to always say something to the effect of, well, they had their own history of problems, and as a straight white male, I should be able to, handle some of their overflow. Again, hurt people hurt people. I had literally weaponized my bleeding heart liberal upbringing and understanding of my privileged identity against myself, and I call that having politics. It's only recently that after a year of staying inside alone during the COVID pandemic of 2020, and incidentally enough, finally watching the full run of The Sopranos for the first time, that I found a bottom, and I got some strength to accept that I am a bit of a victim as well. After decades, I realized multiple things can be true. I can hold an unearned systemic privilege of identity in some spaces, which I need to work to account for. But I can be a victim of interpersonal abuse, which my abusers should also be held accountable for. The wider societal privilege does not justify the abuse or invalidate my personal lived experience. So I did start fighting back. But modern expectations of masculinity made it a really hard, long road.
In a 1967 experiment by American psychologist Martin Seligman, his team of researchers discovered that dogs repeatedly exposed to electric shock in a cage refused to leave their cage once the door was open. The conclusion we can apply to human behavior is that repeated abuse in a trapped situation convinces the victim there is no reality outside of what they've known. The abuse is as good as things can ever get. This theory is explored more philosophically in Jean-Paul Sartre's 1944 play No Exit. A group of three characters finds themselves trapped in an afterlife that is just a room in which they dwell on their sins of their lifetime. After one character, Garçon, repeatedly tries to open a door out of this hell in which the characters find themselves trapped, it suddenly opens, and much like those caged dogs, he doesn't leave. Which brings us to Christopher
Where's my arc?
Moltisanti, who I see as the clearest example of what the writers have to say about the dysfunctional and trapped evolution of masculinity at the end of the 20th century.
You ever feel like nothing good was ever gonna happen to you?
Yeah, and nothing did. So what?
His wrestling with fate and destiny against his desire to be free of his traumatized life is present from early on, but accelerates to take center stage at the story's climactic end. We see early glimpses in him of a desire to step off the hedonic treadmill, under which Christopher and other members of the Life find themselves burying the pain of traumatic upbringings in pursuit of something beyond selfish consumption. Christopher's first example of such desire is his attempt to take acting classes in hopes of improving his screenwriting. Season 2, Episode 5, Big Girls Don't Cry. Christopher channels the loss of his father in a scene he's working on for class. It's revealed he's good at this. He's really good at this. But it's extremely vulnerable, and with no external support, he doesn't have a safe way to handle the emotions that arise. A miscalibrated wiring of his masculinity, which is programmed to respond to all discomfort with violence, has an allergic reaction to healthy expression of emotion and vulnerability, and it goes haywire. It takes control and destroys this chance at freedom as he brutally assaults a classmate on stage to ensure that he will never be welcome back. The door out of hell was open, and his brain was quite literally too miscalibrated to handle it. In controlled therapeutic environments, however, reliving traumatic experiences through acting and stage blocking has actually been shown to heal forms of PTSD, as covered by Bessel van der Kolk in his book, The Body Keeps the Score.
You'll see a group of actors who do Shakespeare with burned out chronic alcoholic veterans. It is stunning. For these guys to have to act a role that they're totally unaccustomed to be able to mouth a line, to be able to think about the meaning of their line and to stand up there and to read it is spectacularly successful.
This being a newer, more experimental therapy, it's fascinating to see the show stumbling upon something so far ahead of its time, and the reactionary failure of such a moment without any clinical controls in place. Moving on with his life as if nothing happened, Christopher continues to violently abuse his girlfriend, his community, his family, and drugs. Eventually, he's become such a nuisance to his boss, Tony, that he's sent to rehab. That's Season 4, Episode 10, The Strong Silent Type. The decision's made not because his family deeply loves and cares for him and wants to see him recover, but because his drug use has become obtrusive to their business. It was costing money. There's no foresight on anyone's part as to what rehab will actually ask of and challenge Christopher to do. Rehab and full abstinence as a resolution for substance abuse, especially in instances where there's a history of trauma, is culturally seen as some catch-all solution, but oftentimes it's not effective or it's cost prohibitive to most addicts. So once again, the door out of hell kind of opens, but it takes external resources and support for the traumatized dogs to ever leave their cage in the learned helplessness experiment discussed earlier. Christopher returns home after rehab to find a family that is verbally supportive in the same superficial surface level way they always are with each other throughout the series, but not the type he needs. They quickly pressure him back to the violent work that forces him to relive the complicated and repeated trauma of his life, which led to drug dependency in the first place.
Which one of the 12 steps you on now?
The only one I haven't exactly done is go around to all the people I fucked over while I was using and apologize.
Maybe you shouldn't do that one.
Between rehab and his death in the final season, he's given the option to enter witness protection with his girlfriend Adriana. That's Season 5, Episode 12, Long-Term Parking. This would provide the opportunity to focus on his writing and become the emotionally vulnerable family man a small voice deep inside him yearns for. But he would have to give up the material comfort and hedonic treadmill pursuit he's been conditioned to follow. This is his first of two final moments when the door out of hell is opened again and he cannot bring himself to walk out. He rejects this first offer after seeing a seemingly poor family at a gas station and their forlorn father in the driver's seat looking tired and desperate. After mentally contrasting this to his life of blind consumption and minimal material struggle, the conclusion his learned helplessness has led him to is that he agrees he'd rather have his girlfriend executed as a traitor than take that risk. His current life is obviously miserable, but the thing these men have been conditioned to fear most is real material struggle of any kind. That's something that for most people in this world is guaranteed as a constant. The men of The Sopranos, of course, suffer endless mental anguish in the exchange. To expand further on the learned helplessness of men in The Sopranos, I'd like to consider these men have made a type of deal with the devil through a historical and Marxist-informed lens. Life in the late 90s and ever since was a few decades into the full-scale neoliberal transition of capitalist economies that worked to expand and lower costs of supply chains for America and a few other industrialized Western states globally. This means that we are now able to put a huge distance, both geographically and in our minds, between our daily consumption and the exploitation that is required to make it so cheap and accessible to us.
My book tries to ask a larger question, whether there is such a thing as a history of human society, the nature of those societies as they progress from, very primitive, agricultural, tribal, up to the kind of liberal democracy and technologically driven capitalism that we have today. And the end of history refers to what I think still remains a question of whether that process is one that can terminate.
The trade-off is we want all those cheap products so readily available, most of us will still have to perform some form of labor to convince ourselves we've earned that comfort. Some of us may not even have to physically strain and suffer much, but our degree of alienation from the labor, the thing we are supposedly making, is deeper than at any other point in history. Most of us in an office and computer-based job can see the rapidly approaching obsolescence and redundancy of our rote tasks, if it hasn't already zoomed by us without our bosses noticing. And for the most part, we don't actually make anything anymore. Less and less Americans make something you can hold in your hand and use for a specific function as their labor. Most of the work in this country not directly related to local infrastructure or medical care falls under a few related categories. 1. Handling the minute logistics of getting the cheap goods other people made halfway around the world to their final destination. Think Amazon, other gig economy delivery and service industry. 2. Making each other feel we're inferior so that we will consume one company's product or corporation's media over another. Think advertising, marketing, anything sales or retail. Or 3, creating the escapes that keep us distracted from the exploitation and decline in the world around us. Think making TV. And when it comes to men, we conditioned them, especially through the 90s, to believe their purpose was something more than this. As discussed in AJ's story, a generation of men had been dysfunctionally raised to assume they are a special individual who's owed comfort, ease, and happiness as the result of his fledgling labor, like a birthright. We find those things either spiritually unfulfilling for the few privileged among us, or out of reach for the majority. And as the line from a certain movie about a certain type of club you're not supposed to talk about, which the kids on Twitter love to insist is also a problematic contributor to toxic masculinity, goes,
"We're very, very pissed off."
Which brings us back to that unique sort of deal with the devil which The Sopranos explores. Between the few capitalists who profit immensely from the system described above, and the rest of us who have to fit into it as alienated consumers and workers, the devil of North Jersey has carved out a special opportunity for our wise guys in the Soprano crew. Their deal is that, unlike the rest of us lumpen proletariat, who will likely struggle just to meet our material needs, a wise guy can consume all the commodified, dopamine-releasing indulgences he can dream of ad infinitum. Women, gambling, drugs, alcohol like Midas before you consume to your heart's content. A soprano man must perform ritualistic closings of the gap between himself and the violent horrors that make consumer capitalism in America possible. Do you want that designer watch made from exploited labor, slave mining, and rare earth metals whose harvests are rapidly making the planet hostile to human and other life? On your warehouse or desk job salary, that's far too expensive to be able to afford to peacefully walk into a perfume-scented, warmly lit early 2000s department store and purchase one from the pretty woman at the counter while music plays. Still want it? Well, then you have to look into the eyes of the poor migrant delivery man driving the truck you're going to steal it from and pull the trigger yourself. A trope played out multiple times by gang members knocking off trucks throughout the series. Almost every male character in The Sopranos unabashedly raises his hand and answers the offer of this life. Yes, please, pick me, pick me. As Americans, we all make that same choice every day to get up and consume in a manner more destructive than most of the world's population. But we choose it every day from our birth and as the cultural norm, and most importantly, from a very vast distance from the exploitation that brings it to us. We don't even see it as a choice we are making. The choice is already made. It's societal. It's systemic. We are an individual in a massive machine. In all honesty, is there much use feeling guilty about it? Even if someone opens the door for you to exit, where do you go? Sell off everything you have, fly halfway around the world to bear witness to suffering? What material difference will that really make? So what stops many of us good liberals from further indulging in a bit more of that abusive masculinity like the cast of The Sopranos? Did we just never get the offer?
Oh, but you can! So you may have to metaphorically make a deal with the devil. And by devil, I mean robot devil. And by metaphorically, I mean get your coat.
The Sopranos excels at assuring us over and over that consumption will never be the thing that makes us happy. But the more the cultural weight of our warped sense of masculinity influences our willingness to get up close with that violence, the more we will usually be rewarded with the option to further consume. Be the guy that pulls the trigger, the banker that forecloses on the home, the guy who manipulates and jacks up medication prices. You can buy another car, another home, another yacht. Doesn't it feel good to be bad?
Yes.
The Sopranos' play is to portray its characters boisterously and often comedically, exclaim, "Of course it feels good," while in front of their boys. And then crushingly reminding us over and over in quiet, lonely moments, the painful reality that it actually crushes the soul. Which brings us back to the final moments of Christopher's tragic arc and his last chance to walk out of hell, to exit the shock cage. His final episodes are rife with tension with Tony and his crew, and it shows Christopher's final desperate battle with his addiction. It seems he's captured a small twinkle of understanding that he sold his soul to that devil of capitalism, and his life's been a misguided performance of masculinity. He's maybe realized his entire life up to that point was a lie. He's perhaps realized leaving the life and taking that chance at material struggle is his only shot at ever finding relief from his trauma, his disease, and discovering genuine happiness. We see him have pangs of genuine catharsis that lean towards self-actualization and connections he's made in 12-step meetings. He seems to enjoy these calm meetings with seemingly nice men in coffee shops, far removed from his world of boisterous mob meetings in smoky strip clubs full of male aggression that is his work environment. Meanwhile, it's contrasted with the strains it places on his personal and business relationships with the family that has been constant throughout his entire life. They're frustrated he doesn't want to come to the Bada Bing for work, where he's constantly distracted by the temptation to indulge his disease. In a final attempt to see if he can thread the needle of both lives, we're shown what was, for me, among the most tragic scenes in the entire series. Christopher convinces himself he can control his addiction and agrees to indulge in just a few drinks to make a truce in an ongoing dispute with Paulie. As he offers this olive branch and a willingness to meet his crew halfway, he becomes the center of a ball-breaking session.
She takes after you. She won't be at a fourth grade by then. Of course, by that time, she'll be working here, so who gives a shit?
The camera places us in Christopher's point of view as a lingering slow-motion shot pans a semicircle of what are supposed to be his closest friends. They are relentlessly laughing at him, as we can imagine the spit flinging from their disgusting, swollen jowls. It's the moment the last of Christopher Moltisanti's humanity and potential desire to exit the cage dies. All that's left is the husk of his living body rapidly accelerating towards destruction as he realizes he doesn't have the strength to escape his learned helplessness. From here, he drives drunk to his screenwriting partner's home. The scene emphasizes that Christopher's inability to quit the cult of masculine performance is the thing that truly has killed him. His partner, who he has physically assaulted multiple times in acts of coercion, politely lets him into his home. He seems to offer a genuine helping hand. He appeals to the small pieces of humanity he's witnessed in Christopher in the 12-step program. But to the drunk and broken Christopher, it falls flat. In his frustration of Christopher's unwillingness to listen or be reckoned with, he finally exalts the hard truth.
Chris, you're in the mafia.
Now, why is this such an important turn of phrase? Why is it so triggering for Christopher? Throughout the entire series, no one in the mafia uses the word mafia. The only person who's allowed to use it without being physically assaulted is Meadow in Season 1, Episode 5, College. She asks her father alone in the car.
Are you in the mafia?
Am I in the what?
He skirts around using the actual word to define himself as such, exclaiming,
It's a stereotype, and it's offensive. There is no mafia.
However, he continues on to subtly admit as much. Outside of this moment, we only ever hear the word through a TV screen or newspaper headline. This is to say that in their world, that's a word used by the propagandists to disparage their lifestyle and their Italian heritage. And thus, they've learned to deflect the term in the context they're most commonly acquainted with hearing it. But being truly challenged to reckon with the reality of what they are is a threat to the poison pumping their lifestyle of anxious adrenaline through their hearts. That grossly deformed, generations-evolved patriarchy and performance of dysfunctional forms of masculinity driving all their actions from wire to wire of the series. And so, unwilling to face that voice's call to reality, Christopher chooses to silence it with violence. He shoots his partner point blank in the face. One last chance at a wake-up call. One final refusal and objection, because his soul already left his body back at that bar. His final moments come in the opening scenes of the following episode. We see him struggling to breathe alongside Tony immediately after flipping a car they're in. Tony briefly weighs the option between calling for help or ending Christopher's life, in a way no one could ever trace to him. Tony justifies killing his junkie nephew to himself after seeing a tree branch through the back seat of Christopher's car, impaling the seat where his newborn daughter would have been had she been along for the ride. This may seem like a bold choice, placing the death of perhaps the second leading role outside the main family of the series abruptly and at the beginning of an episode, but it makes sense for his death to be sudden, abrupt, unexpected, and inglorious. We've already seen him die. Why not be finished at the hands of the man who is the personification of the devil that offered him that lifestyle in the first place? He was taught to trust this man from birth. By the time he could see the reality that Tony raised and kept him in an electrified, caged hell, it was too late. Why should he have any reason to believe the world outside of it could have been any different?
That's the guy, Adriana. My Uncle Tony. The guy I'm going to hell for.
About halfway through season 1 of this 20 years late binge of The Sopranos, I paused it on a screen cap of Junior Soprano and his thick framed glasses, his prominent Italian nose, and I sent that screen cap to my sister in a text, and I wrote, Junior Soprano looks like Grandpa Jay, in a Kangol. No, really, like, this is the text right here. But curiously enough, he was actually more of German descent. It's our paternal grandmother, his wife, that our Sicilian roots come from. And Corrado, junior soprano actor Dominic Chianese, I can never get that right. Anyway, he's of Napoli descent. But still, throughout the series, he'd glimmer through as the spitting image of that elder patriarch of my family. Perhaps the connection was his whole oeuvre as a man of a certain age with a certain way of speaking in his cozy little home. But contrasting to my own grandfather, Junior is always somehow sad for a man so proud of having run with his gang for so many years in his little house countered against his nephew Tony's gaudy McMansion. Another man we see early on in the series as materially comfortable, but never content, never happy, always alone. Junior Soprano's journey through the series is one that, on its surface, sees the most drastic transitions and tragic falls. It's also perhaps the best to outline the tonal shift of the series and slow burn of its messages about what's broken in our cultural definitions of masculinity as it plows through season by season, defining what exactly this prestige TV thing is all about. I describe the full Sopranos series as like watching the birth of a baby calf, a bloody mess pulled out on the floor, yet adorable in its stumbling.
Just when they thought I was out, they pull me back in.
But eventually it cleans up to find its legs and confidence. Consider the contrast of our introduction to Junior to our final goodbye with him. By the time you reach the series finale, it's hard to believe the characterization of Junior Soprano in season 1 is even part of the same show. There are some discrepancies about professional hierarchy happening in the background of Junior's story, as he is installed as boss of the Soprano family pretty much in name only midway through season 1. But it's apparent to me that the real rub of his anger is that the younger generation of bosses have found out he has a penchant for performing oral sex on his longtime guma. Aside from taking out a hit on his own nephew, he also weaponizes the gossip that Tony's seen as psychiatrist.
Hey, listen, my friend. At least I can deal with my own problems. Unlike some I know.
What's that supposed to mean?
As a millennial who was 13 years old at the show's launch and didn't watch it till 2021 at age 35, it's hard to bring to focus from the writer's perspective the degree to which these trivial grievances were meant to be hyperbolized for laughs at the absurd fragility of this brand of masculinity regarding mental health and sexuality, or to which they wanted us to really feel the emotional investment these men would place in these situations.
If this is true, Livia, you know what I mean, I'm the boss, for Christ's sake.
While we may laugh at this through a 2021 lens, it's easy to put the period of the show's conception into context and see how plausible it may be that this was to be taken seriously. If you'd spent only an hour watching MTV or late night cable at the time, you'd come away with an understanding that the performance of male heterosexuality as an act of power domination in culture was the way of the world. That satisfying the male libido is the most important thing to a cultured society.
You ever hear of something called the freeze-out? Anyone who understands compliance ladders, anyone who understands Kino escalation within comfort properly, will already know what freeze-outs are.
From hypersexualized teen pop stars being questioned about their bodies and sexuality by much older men at late-night desks who held a monocultural grasp on the national conversation.
There's one subject we didn't discuss.
Mm-hmm.
What was that? Everyone's talking about it.
What?
Well, your breasts.
Can you cut to commercial now?
No.
Like soon?
To wall-to-wall Girls Gone Wild promotions, to teen sex film romps a la American Pie, the moment made clear that the entire world is focused on the fantasies of hetero male sexual power and female submission to it. Women were sold to us as nothing more than objects to serve our pleasure. It's possible a male writer, wealthy and well-connected enough to make it to an HBO writer's room in 1999, could see the embarrassment of a 70-year-old man's colleagues discovering he actually pleasures his sexual partner as detrimental to his entire hierarchical status, which the audience should feel some empathy for. Not the hilarious satire of masculine fragility, which it has evolved to 22 years later. The entire Cold War between Tony and his uncle over these sexual and mental health stigmas is played as tonally serious in a way that leaves me wondering if I would have still viewed it through the same satirical lens had my 13-year-old self been exposed to it at the time of its release, while swimming through all the other cultural sludge mentioned above. People love to argue that culture has no impact on behavior, but decades later, in the aftermath of an era of hetero male sexuality celebrated, often to the point of violence and domination over women's bodies, can we honestly say it has had no impact on generations of men who have grown up with an IV of it plugged into our veins? Is the evolution of things like Gamergate, Incildom, online men's rights activists, red pill mentality of the mid-2010s to, say, the performative LARPing, violent and aggressive protests of Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, and Trump supporters on the streets of Portland today, or at the Capitol in January in 2021, really just a spontaneous eruption we have no historical or material explanation for? I'm sure if you asked any writer of The Sopranos about this now, they'd probably tell you the whole point of shows or movies like theirs are to show you examples of how not to act. But I find it hard to believe that dorm room after dorm room of young men in the early 2000s were plastered with posters of Pacino and Scarface, De Niro and Pesci in Goodfellas, Brad Pitt in Fight Club, or James Gandolfini in The Sopranos, hung on their walls as pious reminders to themselves of how not to behave. And I was one of them, so I know. This is our introduction to Junior Soprano, a problematic man of his time.
A Chinaman goes...
But not quite so clear in its satire as to the degree to which we should laugh at him or feel empathy for him.
Fucking hand is stuck down the drain, and I can't reach the fucking phone!
The message is further complicated as his story continues from season to season to explore the relationship between dementia and loneliness. For me, he evolves from satirical comic foil to true empathetic warning of that which I fear most, being alone at the end of things. That grandfather I referenced at the beginning of this segment lost his wife to cancer in the early 90s, and then lived nearly 25 more years unmarried, alone in his home. I like to think he was content, the last of a generation that still saw the importance in being constantly surrounded by family and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but being given glimpses into the life of Junior Soprano's loneliest, dementia-ridden moments as the seasons go on, these images of our elders we rarely see as we typically only make time for brief, infrequent visits during our busy lives, I wonder about their loneliness. My grandparents in their late years, my parents now. As stated at the beginning of this piece, The Sopranos' method is to get you to ask yourself these questions by amplifying them with a bullhorn. Junior Soprano was a rotten, lonely man throughout his life of crime, never married, no children, and so alienated from the family he has that he puts a hit out on his nephew one season and shoots him in another, albeit in a fit of dementia. So it's easy to paint the depths of his loneliness on the screen. But the question remains, is this what life has in store for all of us as we approach the end of things in a world increasingly designed to fill our happiness with isolated consumption over community and family? I feel pain watching Junior's descent as I reflect on my life isolated from family and unmarried in my mid-30s with a history of mental health struggles that make me question, what will my mind be like at the end of things? Who will care for me? In his final scene of the series, Tony, feeling the walls close around him, seems to finally decide to forgive his Uncle June the only way he knows how. He reminisces on his business accomplishments and ends with,
You're my dad. You two ran North Jersey.
Tony tells him this in a tone desperate for validation that his pursuit of the same will vindicate him and affirm him as a good man.
We did? Yeah.
That's nice.
Junior mutters with a dismissive and submissive tone as he then mindlessly gazes back into the distance to tell us none of this ever mattered. All the violence, all the anger, all the hatred to carve out a piece of property, wealth, and land over generations in response to lifetimes of trauma meant nothing as we reach the end of things and are forced to face whatever may be on the other side all alone. We see the realization trigger in Tony's eyes as he paces out ever so slightly off kilter in what is perhaps the most powerful, important scene in the entire series. For me, witnessing this moment is like Ebenezer Scrooge's encounter with the ghost of Christmas yet to come, as it points at his neglected grave. If not for this alienated labor and cultural malaise I find myself trapped in a cycle of investing my time and energy into, then what is it all for? The striking impact of The Sopranos after all these years is that it can force me to get uncomfortable and think about all these existential and cultural questions that uniquely challenge privileged American men like myself in a way few shows do, while still being obsessively bingeable. Is this what great art does? Make us uncomfortable while still drawing us in? Can television exist as a great art that challenges us to deeply question our understanding of the world and our place in it, while still satisfying the model of large-scale production and profit required to make it? Overall, I'd say no. The Sopranos stands as a flash in the pan, a lightning bolt at a very specific moment in history that cannot strike again. It came about at a moment that the foundation for vertical integration of corporate media had been laid via maneuvers like the 1996 Telecommunications Act that would start rallying the wagons of capital around mass media in terms of who could produce it and for whom, in an even more aggressive way than it already had been up to that point. It's a last dying gasp of the possibility of true auteurism, slipping scripts past the boardrooms of production executives mostly unchallenged to grab a chunk of capital with which to create something truly daring. Most big-budget media we see now is carefully curated, knowing in advance who the messaging and themes are for and what the expected return on investment in the form of profit will be. This yields endless programming, careful not to wander too far outside what is already measured and gauged as palatable to established consumers of prestige TV or culture.
1, 2, better not sue.
In the past decade or so, I've watched countless shows that reviewers rave to be excellent critiques of white privilege or toxic masculinity, but none of them ever actually challenge me to go inward and explore the depths of those realities the way The Sopranos did. I usually walk away from them thinking, yeah, I know. It is a safer market bet to reinforce the already established virtues of an in-group than risk alienating an audience by challenging them to think outside their preconceived notions.
I didn't have no million people out there marching and protesting to get me my job.
No, his uncle got it for him.
So when asked for reviews of such shows, I usually find myself telling people it just felt like watching Twitter.
What about your legs? The water takes the soap and it trickles down my body.
Our culture has become fractured into niche in-groups that are then neatly separated and organized in online spaces, which happen to be owned and controlled by profit-driven private companies. Those of us with the disposable income to purchase and consume this type of media gather together there to discuss it, and don't see or hear from anyone outside. There's some overlapping assumptions I touched on back in the intro that a producer can make about that in-group and its spending or consumption habits. They are likely college-educated and white, and if not white, still probably college-educated, living in or near metro areas, interested in liberal social values, etc. Producers no longer need to take risks or challenge us in new daring ways. They already know our morals, our values, and how to reinforce them in their content. They are able to carefully decide for us how to do this and push our emotional buttons in a carefully controlled way based on the almighty algorithm. If you tune into the right spaces of Twitter or Reddit long enough, you'll find you can predict the beats, language, themes, and arcs of almost any new prestige TV content minutes into its introduction. The Sopranos defined the broad concept of prestige TV with its over-the-top production quality, but also its challenging perspectives and unpredictability. Without that, what makes any of it stand out? But The Sopranos is a perfectly contained story that made me uncomfortable and challenged me to reckon with the trajectory of my masculinity at just the right time in my life. I don't need or even really want more of it. Now, not that the show is the cause, but it's interesting to consider that for the first time in my life, I started to seriously seek the appropriate professional help for the traumas discussed throughout various sections of this in the months since finishing the show. Entertainment for entertainment's sake is fine. It's great. On the rare occasion, it elevates to the level of art or has some relevancy to socio-political movements. But we've been duped by both consumer and social media conglomerates into believing these are all inherently the same and equal to one another, that consuming this content is politics. They're convinced that a big budget and some spit shine on anything they make will trick us into believing it's on equal standing with the absolute best of the medium.
Now, we have the option to prove them wrong. We can occasionally step back, think more critically about what we are consuming. We can mindfully ask ourselves if products and content choices are made by corporations with the intent of emotionally manipulating us into believing that shallow entertainment has political meaning both before and after we consume them. Corporations are often counting on us to take to their social media and other online platforms to perform emotional outrage about their products publicly. This keeps us riled up and gathers more eyeballs that don't want to be left out of the discourse. It keeps us scrolling. It keeps us posting. At a minimum, taking time to reflect on this in our media diet might help us to calm down online. And who knows? Eventually, a mindful approach to our consumption might even inspire us to log off and connect in real ways that help us see nuance outside of our binary understanding of online, cultural, and political values. I took the time to write this piece because I approached The Sopranos in the spring of 2021 as I awaited a COVID vaccine, doing my best to divorce myself from infusing social or political expectations on it, as we've been indoctrinated to do in recent years. In doing so, I was pleasantly surprised in the ways it made me uncomfortably meditate on my core beliefs. I knew it was understood as the darling genesis of prestige TV. I had no idea the extent to which being produced in a time before the rules were written would give it room to elevate to something its successors will always struggle to live up to. Hi, I'm Josh, aka Carl's manager on the internet, and I made that whole thing. I wrote it, I put together the video, etc., etc. So I figured I have your attention because we're about an hour and 7 minutes in, and I want to just provide some thoughts and updates on this piece since I wrote it last summer, stealing this concept of sort of editorializing your own video at the end from Tim Rogers of actionbutton.com. Here it goes. First, I cannot see myself or I'll lose my mind. I just finished watching what is pretty darn close to the final cut of that video. So I thought, well, first of all, do all the stupid bullshit, like, subscribe, ding the bell, comment, whatever. Hey, chill. There's a wide gap between where that project started and where it ended up. So, like, I watched pretty close to the final cut. This page here is what needs to change. It's like 7 things, and then it's going up. So, first of all, I just want to say the guy who made that is okay. Maybe I see it more than it comes off in the thing, but there was a process of trying to tone down how like intense I was being at every stage of making this. So let me walk through the calendar. Right now it is out April 19th at 10:06 p.m. and I did the stand-ups where I'm actually on camera are the very last thing I did. So if you pay attention, you'll notice that those are tonally the lightest probably part of the whole thing. So that's all to say that the first draft of this happened a couple months after I finished watching The Sopranos in May of 2021, so almost a year ago. And I was not doing well. I want to actually very seriously endorse the book that came up, The Body Keeps the Score, changed my life. And a lot of the like pop psychology stuff that comes up in the video is initially sourced from that book and then maybe expanded upon elsewhere to learn more for the writing of this. It's great. If you think you have any degree of PTSD or trauma or whatever, not like I was in a war zone, and even then, absolutely you should, like any little thing, go read that book. I read that book. I told my therapist about it and about a abuse thing that had come up that was causing me some problems, I thought. And she said, you should try this therapy that I'm starting to study called EMDR. But it definitely changed my life. So that's all to say that I wrote the first draft of this before all of that. And only 2 people have seen the completely unedited draft. One of them, he just said he liked it, and that was very kind of him because I had not yet read his very personal, vulnerable essay that he wrote around the same time yet, that he had sent to me like 2 weeks earlier. So Ronnie, if you make it to this, your writing is incredible, your photography is incredible, and the way you tie them to personal stories and history are all incredible. Maybe I'll like ding a link to him somewhere. Anyway, the other person that read it was my editor, Sean, who is the best. And there's one line, I don't remember what it was, and I wish I could remember his exact quote, where his note was something like, "This sounds like the manifesto of a cult leader," or something like that, which was my first clue that's like, maybe I'm putting too much onto the page and like should dial it back. So that's like the first stage. He did a great job editing, trimmed a ton of fat, believe it or not, things that got off topic. And now that I've spent like 9 months with it, I can like see like, oh, I really did have a couple theses, and boom, 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 I hit them and we got there. So thank you very much, Sean, for that. Then I started by recording the audio, the narration for everything. And at that point, I was starting to realize the written version of this essay, it tonally is not the same as I hear it in my head. To somebody who doesn't personally know me, it sounds like too depressive, too sardonic. You know, there's definitely elements of that in the humor. And I was like, oh, I need my voice in this. And that was kind of the genesis of like, well, let's at least like record myself reading it. And so I did that, and then I sat on that for like another month, and then I started pulling clips and putting it together, and I immediately thought, this is still like too melodramatic. This is still like too saccharine, too precious. And that is still mostly the audio that's in there. And it annoyed me so much that I went back, and the very first line I reread because it sounded so again, like saccharine and like precious, that I was like, this is, I'm taking this too seriously. So like each step I was sort of like shedding some of my, I want to say like armor around the topic. I was getting, the more distance I got from it, the more I could treat it, I think, with a bit of the tongue-in-cheekness that it needed and deserved. And I hope that comes out in some clip selection, some of the editorial choices in the video. And then again, in the stand-up, I cut a lot of content there, like the stuff that got like really personal. If you want that, that's still in the published essay on Substack. It's just like a sentence or two here and there that I was like, this is too distracting from the purpose of the video. It works in writing, but in the video, it's not quite the tone that I want. But I still wanted it to be very personal. So cut some of that, and you'll see, like, again, that's the last thing I recorded. It's the lightest, sort of snappiest, I think, narration and attitude on it, which is what I wanted to convey. I don't want this to be something that people watch and go, I feel sad about life now. The world is sad. If that's how you feel, like I'd hope you just feel, if you identified with anything that was going on there, that you're like, somebody out there sees me and gets me. That's like the main reason I like to do stuff like this, because when I was younger, and even to this day, that's the kind of stuff that really hits me, is when I'm like, oh, one other person sees things the way I do, so it's gonna be okay. I'm not alone in this. Which leads me to the next thing that I really wanted to do, like a postmortem backtrack on, which is the language. I was struggling in writing this last summer over and over again, just bending over backwards to avoid any positive use of the phrase toxic masculinity, because I kind of hate that phrase. And you'll notice the one time it gets used, it's to mock it. And that's to say, like, the intended audience for writing this, I don't know if it'll ever reach them because we all live in an echo chamber, is somebody who, you know, maybe they're not like a far gone, like, MAGA chud guy, but somebody who maybe doesn't quite understand the issues with patriarchy to like a full extent. Like my sort of mission in my creativity, my writing, whatever, is to explore and create space where you can feel comfortable being masculine without having to endorse patriarchy. So a couple big things I wish had happened before I made this were that I had read, oh my God, I'm blanking on the name. Let me go grab it off the shelf. Huzzah! Now I do need the camera. I wish I had read this, Bell Hooks, The Will to Change, before I wrote this essay, because I, again, was struggling with dysfunctional masculinity, this masculinity, all these different ways I wanted to phrase it, and she just slices through all of that language, which, by the way, this is a book on men and masculinity and why we need those things from the perspective of a queer black feminist writer, which, like, if you're not like a whatever lefty lib, I know that sounds corny, but like it really does matter. And she sums it up as, you know, we live in a like a racist, patriarchal, colonial, imperial, capitalist something. And she says it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but that is like just a boom, 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 concise way to cut through a lot of what I was trying to say. So if I had just stuck with the word patriarchy anytime I wanted to bring that topic up or like phrase what I was trying to say about masculinity, if I'd read this book, I would have just made a lot more concise use of language when I was talking about it. Because what I'm trying to say, there is a version of masculinity that's good. It's the patriarchy that is the problem. The patriarchy is the system that indoctrinates a lot of the stuff that I was talking about into us. So really wish I had read this before writing it, but hey, that's why I'm just riffing now. And I'm showing feet. Don't pull your feet up. And I kind of wish I had read Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. It also provides some good language for some of the stuff I was trying to address about sort of like living in late stage capitalism and not really seeing any other way out, especially in the stuff where I'm talking about like Our Generation and AJ Soprano, and this feeling of like all you can do is just kind of consume. And I kind of touch on it in that what we do is we consume in a way that makes us be able to project that, like, I'm consuming the right products that show that I know things are bad, therefore I'm doing my part. I think that came across. So yeah, that's the biggest thing I've ever done. If you liked it, like, leave a comment or whatever if this makes it to YouTube, if I don't get copyright stricken, which I saw some places I might have to put in some extra work to try to avoid. tell me like you're digging this, because I'll make more of it that is maybe 70 to 80% shorter, so that it doesn't take me a year to do each one. Would be kind of the ideal, I guess. It feels weird to be done with this. It was sort of like an exorcism of all of that. If you paid attention, started about 30 years ago, and now I just feel like drained. I'm not really sure what to do next. So yeah, any sort of positive, hey, cool deal, man, will kind of help me to keep going and figure out what to do next. At a certain point, I wasn't even really attached to the content. It was just sort of like something is thrusting me to get this done, to like prove to myself I can do it, and to get this all out of me. Back to what I was saying at the beginning, the guy who made that, he's doing pretty good now. He's all right. So he quit his job. He's working as a freelance producer. If you need somebody to produce something like this, anything audio related, you can follow a link that's probably in there somewhere and find me, and I'll be happy to do your thing with you. 'Cause I feel like there's a lot of political stuff or socioeconomic views going on in there, and I like stand by everything that's in there. But I feel like it came off a lot more hopeless than the direction I want to be going in the future, or with future projects and content or whatever, because I feel like there's a media sphere out there now that wants to inform people and connect people and build things sort of like to the left of like the American Democratic Party. But it's all who can have the silliest, most cynical, angry take on whatever dumb like spectacle thing happened today. And I want to move away from that. I want people to have some hope that, if you connect to things that are directly in front of you in your community, your town, your family, whatever, just plant the seeds and may 1,000 flowers bloom. And you might not be there to see them bloom, but like at least you did what you could. That's kind of where I'm at. I just wanted to address, because I feel like that evolution happened between the time that I initially wrote this and now. And I worry about like the tone it comes off in, and that I maybe am feeding into that cynicism a little bit in chunks of that video. So stay hopeful, keep your nose to the ground, keep your ears and eyes open. And
most importantly, smash that like and subscribe and ring the bell and comment and feed my ego.
So all that being said about like being too cynical, too sardonic, too whatever, I guess I'll leave this off with my sort of like motto that I've been saying and affirmating, I guess, to myself, is act on compassion, kindness, and joy for yourself first. That was the thing I spent the last year learning, and that will grow into a sort of font that you can pull from to spread that to other people and the rest of the world. So that's what I wanted to update from since I wrote that in the depths of despair in the summer of 2021. So thanks for watching it, and I don't know. I guess I'll see you on the next one.